On October 20th, 2011, in a drainage pipe outside the Libyan city of Sirte, one of Africa's most controversial leaders met a violent end. Muammar Gaddafi, the man who had ruled Libya for 42 years, was dragged through the streets, beaten and killed by rebel fighters. His last words, reportedly, were, "What did I do to you?" It was a question that echoed across an entire continent, because the answer depended entirely on who you asked. To some, Gaddafi was a visionary who challenged Western imperialism, championed African unity, and used Libya's oil wealth to transform his country from one of the poorest nations on earth into one with the highest living standards in Africa. To others, he was a brutal dictator, a state sponsor of terrorism, and a destabilizing force whose megalomania turned the Sahel into a powder keg that still burns today. This is the story of Muammar Gaddafi, where liberation and oppression walk hand in hand, and where one man's dream of African unity helped create the chaos we see across the Sahel today. Muammar Gaddafi was born in 1942 in a Bedouin tent in the desert into a Libya that didn't belong to Libyans. Italy had colonized the country in 1911, killing nearly half of Libya's population through warfare and concentration camps. Gaddafi's own grandfather died fighting the Italian occupation. When Libya gained independence in 1951, King Idris ruled a country where illiteracy exceeded 90% and Western oil companies extracted billions while Libyans starved. Young Gaddafi grew up in this environment of humiliation, deeply influenced by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's pan-Arab nationalism and defiance of Western powers. On September 1st, 1969, 27-year-old Captain Gaddafi and his Free Officers movement executed a bloodless coup. They immediately closed foreign military bases and nationalized the oil industry. Money that had been flowing to Western corporations would now flow to the Libyan people. And in many ways, it did. The transformation was remarkable. Gaddafi invested oil revenues in free healthcare, free education, and housing. Literacy rates soared from less than 10% to over 90%. Libya went from one of Africa's poorest countries to one with the highest human development index on the continent. For many Africans, Gaddafi was proof that a leader could stand up to the West and win, that oil wealth could benefit Africans rather than enrich foreign shareholders. But there was a darker side evident from the beginning. Gaddafi's political philosophy rejected both capitalism and communism, but in practice meant total power consolidated in his hands. Political parties were banned, independent media was crushed, dissent was not tolerated. Revolutionary committees monitored the population, and those who spoke out simply disappeared. The Abu Salim prison massacre of 1996, where an estimated 1,200 prisoners were murdered, stands as one of Libya's darkest moments. Gaddafi's destabilizing influence extended far beyond Libya's borders. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, he bankrolled revolutionary movements worldwide, the IRA, the PLO, communist insurgencies in Latin America, rebel groups across Asia. If you opposed a Western government, Gaddafi would likely give you money and weapons. In 1986, Libyan agents bombed a Berlin nightclub, killing 3 people. Then came Lockerbie. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Scotland, killing 270 people. Investigation pointed to Libyan intelligence agents, leading to years of international sanctions that crippled Libya's economy. These actions made Gaddafi an international pariah and sponsor of terrorism. But in Africa, the story looked different.
By the late 1990s, Gaddafi had pivoted from Pan-Arabism to Pan-Africanism. He proposed a United States of Africa with a single currency, military and passport. He advocated for African solutions to African problems and breaking free from Western economic dominance. And he invested billions across Africa, infrastructure projects, telecommunications, hospitals, schools, and scholarships for thousands of African students. When Nelson Mandela needed support against apartheid, Gaddafi provided it, even when it meant defying international sanctions. Gaddafi was instrumental in creating the African Union in 2002 and pushed for African financial independence. He advocated for an African investment bank, an African monetary fund, and a gold-backed currency to replace dependence on the dollar and euro. These proposals terrified Western powers. A financially independent Africa would fundamentally reshape global economic power. For many Africans who had suffered under IMF structural adjustment programs, Gaddafi's Pan-Africanism was inspiring, but his methods of promoting African unity involved the same interventionist tactics that caused chaos elsewhere.
The Sahel became the laboratory for Gaddafi's most destructive policies. From 1978 to 1987, Libya engaged in the Toyota War in Chad, supporting various factions in a conflict that killed tens of thousands. Gaddafi claimed he was supporting revolution. In reality, he pursued territorial ambitions over the mineral-rich Al-Zoo Strip. The Chadian intervention became a quagmire that ended in humiliation. But the real damage was what it did to Chad itself, destroyed infrastructure, displaced hundreds of thousands, and fractured Chadian society. The weapons Gaddafi poured into the region spread throughout the Sahel, fueling conflicts for decades. In Mali and Niger, Gaddafi supported Tuareg rebels, recruiting thousands into his Islamic Legion. These fighters gained military experience and weapons, and when they returned home, they brought instability. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, he backed Charles Taylor, one of Africa's most brutal warlords, whose insurgency resulted in horrific atrocities, including widespread use of child soldiers. This was the fundamental contradiction. Gaddafi spoke of African unity while systematically undermining the sovereignty of African nations. He claimed to oppose imperialism while practicing his own form of it. By 2011, Gaddafi had rehabilitated himself somewhat in Western eyes. But inside Libya, resentment had been building. The Arab Spring inspired Libyans to demand change. When protests began in February 2011, Gaddafi ordered brutal suppression. As regime forces advanced on Benghazi, threatening massacre, NATO intervened with airstrikes. What started as humanitarian intervention became regime change. Libya descended into chaos, becoming a failed state. The country fractured along regional lines. Militias proliferated. ISIS gained a foothold. Slavery re-emerged in detention centers. And Gaddafi's weapons spread across the Sahel. Fighters who had served in his forces returned home, sparking a Tuareg rebellion in Mali that was hijacked by jihadist groups. The jihadist insurgency in the Sahel today traces directly to the power vacuum created by Gaddafi's fall. So who was Muammar Gaddafi? His dying words, "What did I do to you?" have profoundly different answers depending on perspective. If you benefited from Libya's free education and healthcare, Gaddafi gave you dignity. If you spent years in Abu Salim prison, he gave you terror. If you remember his support for the anti-apartheid struggle, he was a hero. If you lost loved ones to rebels armed with his weapons, he was a villain. If you're frustrated with neo-colonial financial structures, his vision represents lost opportunity. If you're displaced by jihadists using weapons from his arsenals, his legacy is your insecurity.
The reality is that Gaddafi was both a genuine anti-imperialist and an imperialist himself, a leader who improved millions of lives and destroyed millions more. A Pan-Africanist who invested in African development and a destabilizing force whose actions continue fueling Sahel violence. The most important lesson is that good intentions don't justify authoritarian means, that challenging imperialism doesn't give you the right to practice your own version, that continental unity cannot be built on national oppression. The Sahel is still burning. Jihadist insurgencies control vast territories. Military coups have toppled governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Weapons he distributed decades ago still kill people. Libya remains fractured, its oil wealth now fueling warlords instead of schools. But in many parts of Africa, Gaddafi is still remembered fondly. His portrait appears at protests against neo-colonialism. Young Africans frustrated with corruption and subservience to former colonial powers see him as a leader who dared to say no to the West. This is Gaddafi's legacy, a revolutionary who became what he fought against, a liberator who oppressed, a Pan-Africanist whose greatest legacy may be African disunity. The question, "What did I do to you?" remains unanswered, because the answer is still being written in the conflicts of the Sahel, in debates about African sovereignty, and in the ongoing struggle to define what liberation really means. Gaddafi's story is a warning that the road to African unity cannot be paved with dictatorship, that opposing Western imperialism requires more than rhetoric and weapons, and that the measure of a leader is not what they promise, but what they leave behind. And what Gaddafi left behind is a continent still grappling with the contradictions he embodied, still trying to fulfill the promise of independence he both championed and betrayed.